Some stories aren't just told, they are felt. Welcome to Phoenix Soul Stories. Mr. Langford, your ex-wife is in labor, and the babies are yours. For 3 full seconds, Everett Langford forgot there was a bride waiting for him 20 feet away. The string quartet continued playing beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Manhattan Hotel ballroom, soft notes drifting through white roses and candlelight, as if nothing in the world had changed. 200 guests sat facing the altar, among them investors, politicians, old money families, and executives whose calendars usually required months of negotiation. Today they had all made room for Everett. At 38 he was the billionaire CEO of Langford Meridian Group, a man accustomed to rooms waiting for him to speak. But now he stood near a marble column with his phone pressed to his ear, unable to form a sentence. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "What did you say?" The woman on the line repeated herself carefully. She was calling from St. Catherine's Hospital. Laurel Bennett had been admitted to labor and delivery. There were complications serious enough that the staff had begun reviewing her medical records and emergency contacts. Everett heard every word, yet only one name remained clear. Laurel. His ex-wife. The woman he had not spoken to in almost 8 months. Across the ballroom, his bride stood beneath an arch of ivory flowers watching him. Her smile had faded. Everett turned slightly away, his fingers tightening around the phone. "You said babies." "Yes, Mr. Langford. Babies," he repeated. 2. A pause. A boy and a girl, according to the chart. Somewhere behind him, a champagne glass touched another with a delicate chime. Everett stared at the polished floor. This morning he had reviewed a merger document before breakfast, answered 11 emails in the car, and arrived at his wedding exactly 7 minutes ahead of schedule. Everything had been controlled. Everything had been planned. His tuxedo had been tailored in London. The flowers had arrived from California before sunrise. Security had closed an entire hotel entrance. Even the weather had cooperated, leaving Manhattan beneath a clean September sky. Nothing in Everett Langford's life happened without preparation. Then one phone call had opened a door into a life he knew nothing about. "Why are you calling me?" he asked. The question came out quieter than he intended. The nurse hesitated. "Your number was still listed as a secondary emergency contact in an older patient record," the nurse explained. "It appears the information was never updated. When we reviewed her file during admission, we found it. Former spouse." The phrase felt strangely colder than ex-wife. Everett looked toward the altar again. His chief of staff, Daniel Mercer, stood near the back row now, studying Everett's face. Daniel had worked beside him for 9 years. He knew what Everett looked like when markets collapsed, when acquisitions failed, when reporters surrounded the company headquarters. He had never seen him look like this. Everett lowered his voice. "Did Laurel ask you to call me?" Another pause answered before the nurse did. "No, sir." Everett closed his eyes. For an instant an image surfaced without permission. Laurel standing barefoot in the kitchen of their old townhouse, holding 2 coffee mugs while morning sunlight touched her hair. She had once laughed because he was answering emails during breakfast. He had promised to put the phone away. He could not remember whether he actually had. The memory vanished beneath the sound of the quartet reaching the end of its song. The room grew quieter. People were beginning to whisper. His bride took one small step away from the altar. Everett could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him, but the ballroom suddenly seemed impossibly distant. "How long has she been there?" he asked. "Several hours." Several hours. While his cufflinks were being fastened, Laurel had been in a hospital. While photographers arranged his wedding portraits, she had been preparing to give birth. While guests raised champagne downstairs, 2 children he had never known existed were entering the world. Everett's gaze fell to the gold wedding band waiting on the velvet tray beside the officiant. 5 minutes ago, that ring had represented his future. Now he could barely look at it. "Mr. Langford?" the nurse said. Everett swallowed. "I'm here. The doctor may need to speak with you." Everett's hand went cold around the phone. He glanced once more toward the woman waiting to marry him, then toward the ballroom doors beyond the last row of guests. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO had no strategy, no prepared statement, no decision he could reduce to numbers on a page. He had only one question, and when he finally asked it, his voice was almost a whisper. How far along is she? 36 weeks and 4 days. Everett heard the answer, but the number did not settle in his mind. It followed him into the silence that came after the quartet stopped playing, into the faint murmur spreading through the ballroom, into the memory of a woman he had once known well enough to recognize her footsteps in a dark hallway. 36 weeks meant Laurel had discovered the pregnancy soon after their divorce. It meant there had been months in which two lives were growing while his own moved forward beneath boardroom lights, private flights, investor dinners, and carefully scheduled weekends. Across town, Laurel Bennett gripped the edge of a hospital bed and breathed through another contraction while rain-gray afternoon light pressed against the windows of St. Catherine's. Her dark blonde hair was gathered loosely behind her head. A canvas overnight bag rested on the chair beside the wall, packed with 2 tiny cotton blankets, 2 sets of newborn clothes, and a folder containing every document she might need. There was nothing inside it for Everett. She had planned for that. Planning had become a kind of peace after the divorce. In the small apartment she rented in Brooklyn, mornings belonged to her again. Coffee brewed before sunrise. The windows opened when she wanted them open. No assistant called during breakfast. No driver waited downstairs. No television whispered financial news while a husband answered messages with one hand and promised he was listening. Once there had been a different Everett. Before Langford Meridian occupied 3 floors of a glass tower, he had eaten takeout noodles with her on moving boxes and talked about building a company that would give them freedom. Laurel had believed him because he had believed himself. Success arrived quietly at first, then all at once. 1 office became 5. 5 employees became hundreds. Their townhouse grew larger while their dinners became shorter. Everett began saying, "Just give me 10 minutes. And 10 minutes became midnight. Laurel learned not to ask whether he would be home. She simply stopped setting out 2 plates. Their marriage did not collapse in one spectacular moment. It faded through smaller ones. An anniversary dinner canceled from an airport lounge. A weekend in Vermont interrupted by conference calls. A framed wedding photograph gathering dust on a console table neither of them noticed anymore. The night they finally admitted it was over, Everett stood beside the kitchen island with his jacket still on. Laurel remembered looking at his left hand resting against the marble. His wedding ring was there, but somehow the marriage was not. 6 weeks after the divorce became final, she sat alone in a medical office staring at a test result. She had gone in expecting an explanation for weeks of exhaustion. Instead, the physician smiled gently and turned the monitor toward her. Laurel stared at the screen, one hand rising to her mouth. Then the physician moved the image slightly and said there was something else she needed to see. 2 heartbeats. Laurel walked home that afternoon instead of calling a car. Nearly 3 miles through cold spring air, one hand tucked inside her coat, the other holding the ultrasound envelope against her chest. She stopped twice before reaching her building. Both times she took out her phone. Both times Everett's name remained untouched on the screen. She told herself she needed 1 night to understand what had happened. 1 night became 3 days. 3 days became a week. There had been a moment when she almost told him. She had even gone to his office with the ultrasound folded carefully inside her purse. But something happened there that made her turn around before Everett ever knew she had come. Now, months later, another contraction tightened across her body, and Laurel closed her eyes until it passed. A nurse adjusted the monitor and asked whether there was anyone else she wanted them to contact. Laurel looked toward the empty chair beside the bed. For half a second her expression softened. Then she shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "There is no one else." 20 minutes away, Everett still stood in his wedding tuxedo with the phone against his ear, unaware that the answer to the question tearing through his mind had once been carried all the way to his office door. The nurse answered Everett carefully. Laurel had not asked for him. His number had surfaced only because it was still listed as a secondary emergency contact in an older patient record that had never been updated. That distinction landed harder than he expected. She had carried his children for more than 8 months without asking him for money, help, or even a conversation, and now on the one day when his entire future had been arranged down to the minute, chance had placed her name back in his hand. "Is she all right?" Everett asked. "The medical team is with her now," the nurse replied. That is all I can tell you at this time. Everett thanked her and ended the call. For a moment he remained beside the marble column, staring at the dark screen of his phone. Then he turned. The ballroom had gone almost completely silent. 200 people were pretending not to watch him. His bride, Claire Whitmore, stood beneath the ivory flower arch with both hands resting around her bouquet. She was 35, composed, intelligent, and far too perceptive to accept a convenient lie. Everett walked toward her. Each step seemed louder than the last. When he reached the altar, Claire searched his face. "What happened?" she asked softly. Everett looked at the officiant, then at the guests, then back at her. He could have asked for privacy. He could have invented an emergency at the company and allowed his staff to control the story later. That instinct had protected him through years of business crises. But this was not business. "It was Laurel," he said. Claire's fingers tightened around the bouquet. She knew the name. Everyone close to Everett did. "Your ex-wife." "Yes. What does she want?" Everett looked down. "Briefly. She did not call me." Claire waited. Everett forced himself to say the rest. "She is at St. Catherine's. She is in labor." Confusion crossed Claire's face before understanding arrived. "Why would the hospital call you?" Everett could hear someone shifting in a chair behind him. His mother sat in the front row, perfectly still. Daniel had already moved closer to the aisle. Everett met Claire's eyes. "Because the babies are mine." The room seemed to lose its air. Claire did not speak. Everett did not reach for her. There was no gesture large enough to make the moment smaller. "Babies," she finally whispered. "Twins." Claire looked past him toward the guests, then back at the man she had been seconds away from marrying. "Did you know?" "No." "Are you certain?" "I knew nothing about them until 5 minutes ago." Her eyes remained on his face, searching for something that would make the answer easier to believe. Everett had no proof to offer except the shock he could not hide. From the back of the ballroom, Daniel lifted Everett's overcoat from a chair. He understood before Everett said anything. Claire understood too. "You are going to the hospital," she said. It was not a question. Everett looked at the gold band waiting on the velvet tray. Then he removed the white boutonniere from his lapel and placed it beside the ring. "I have to." Claire lowered her bouquet. Hurt moved across her face, quiet and controlled. Everett wished she would accuse him of something. Anger would have been easier than dignity. "I am sorry," he said. Claire gave a small nod, but she did not tell him it was all right. Everett turned toward the aisle. Whispers rose immediately. Phones appeared in hands. His mother called his name once sharply, but he kept walking. Daniel met him at the doors and handed him the coat. "The car is outside," Daniel said. Everett did not ask how he had arranged it so quickly. Less than 2 minutes later, he stepped into the cool Manhattan afternoon, still wearing the tuxedo in which he had expected to become a husband again. The hotel doors closed behind him, sealing away the flowers, the candles, and the future he had planned. As the car pulled into traffic toward St. Catherine's, Everett stared through the window and understood something that unsettled him more than the abandoned altar. He was racing toward Laurel, but he had no idea whether she would even allow him through the door. By the time Everett reached St. Catherine's, the afternoon had turned the color of steel. He stepped from the car before Daniel could open the door, crossed the hospital entrance in his wedding tuxedo, and drew more than one curious glance beneath the bright lobby lights. None of it registered. At the maternity floor, a receptionist asked his name, then disappeared behind a secured door. Everett waited beside a row of pale blue chairs with his overcoat folded across one arm. His phone vibrated repeatedly in his pocket. Claire. His mother. 3 board members. The head of public relations. He silenced every call without reading the messages. 10 minutes later a nurse approached. "Mr. Langford?" Everett stood immediately. "How is she?" "She is stable. The babies are being monitored closely." Relief came quietly, loosening something in his chest. "Can I see her?" The nurse studied him for a moment. "That is her decision." Everett nodded. For once his name opened no doors. His money changed no rules. He waited while the nurse went inside. Nearly 5 minutes passed before she returned. "She agreed to speak with you." Everett followed her down a corridor filled with soft footsteps and muted voices. At the end, she opened a door and stepped aside. Laurel was sitting upright against white pillows, one hand resting over the hospital blanket. She looked tired but not fragile. Her face had changed slightly since he last saw her, softer around the edges, yet unmistakably Laurel. A monitor beside the bed traced 2 steady rhythms. Everett stopped just inside the doorway. For months he had imagined that if they ever met again, it would happen across a restaurant table or by accident on a Manhattan sidewalk. He had never imagined this. Laurel's eyes moved from his face to the black tuxedo, then to the place where his boutonniere had been. She understood immediately. You were getting married. It was not a question. Everett closed the door quietly behind him. Yes. Laurel looked toward the window. Then why are you here? The hospital called me. Her eyes returned to him. The hospital called you? My number was still listed as a secondary emergency contact in one of your old records. Something almost like frustration crossed her face, but it disappeared before he could name it. She leaned back against the pillow. I did not call you, Everett. For words. No accusation. No raised voice. Somehow that made them heavier. I know. I did not ask anyone to stop your wedding. I know that too. Laurel studied him as if trying to understand why he was still standing there. Then you should go back. Everett looked at the canvas overnight bag on the chair. 2 tiny knitted caps rested on top, one cream and one pale green. Beside them sat a folder labeled with Laurel's handwriting. Everything looked prepared. Everything except a place for him. Are they mine? He asked. Laurel's expression became still. Yes. Everett lowered his eyes for a second. The confirmation should not have surprised him after the phone call, yet hearing it from her changed everything. Why did you not tell me? Laurel turned her face away as another contraction began. She breathed slowly, counting under her breath until the tension passed. Everett instinctively took one step forward then stopped. He did not know whether he had the right to come closer. When Laurel finally opened her eyes, she saw that he had remained where he was. You do not get to arrive on the hardest day of my life and begin with questions about what I should have done, she said quietly. Everett absorbed the words without defending himself. You are right. That answer seemed to surprise her more than an argument would have. He pulled the visitor chair away from the wall but did not sit. Tell me what you need. Laurel glanced at him. I already have what I need. Everett looked around the room again. The packed bag, the paperwork, the water bottle within reach, the empty chair beside her bed. 8 months of preparation surrounded him in small, ordinary objects, and not one of them expected Everett Langford to appear. His phone vibrated again. This time he took it out, turned it completely off, and placed it face down on the windowsill. Laurel watched without comment. I am not asking you to forgive anything, he said. I am asking if I can stay until I know you and the babies are safe. Silence settled between them. Outside the window, Manhattan continued moving beneath the gray sky. Finally, Laurel looked toward the empty chair. You can sit, she said. Everett sat down. It was not forgiveness. It was not welcome. But for the first time that day, he understood that staying did not mean taking control. Sometimes it meant waiting quietly until someone decided whether there was still a place for you at all. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of them spoke about the question Everett had asked. The room filled instead with small sounds. The steady monitors, the wheels of a cart passing in the hallway, Laurel breathing carefully whenever another contraction came. Everett remained in the visitor chair, his jacket folded across his knees, learning the unfamiliar discipline of being present without trying to manage anything. Finally, Laurel looked toward the window. I was going to tell you. Everett raised his eyes but said nothing. 6 weeks after the divorce was final, I found out I was pregnant. A few days later I found out there were 2. Her hand rested over the blanket. I spent a week trying to decide how to say it. Everett remembered those weeks differently. He had been preparing a major acquisition, sleeping 4 hours a night, moving through meetings as though exhaustion were proof of importance. You came to my office, he said slowly, remembering what she had hinted at before. Laurel nodded. I had the ultrasound in my purse. The memory returned to her with uncomfortable clarity. She had stood on the 42nd floor of Langford Meridian headquarters beneath cold white lights, surrounded by glass walls and people who moved quickly because Everett valued speed. His assistant had told her he was finishing a meeting. Laurel had almost waited. Then she heard Everett's voice through the conference room door. He was speaking with his mother and 2 board members about the company's public image. After the divorce, investors were nervous. Reporters were asking questions. His mother wanted the past contained before it affected the future. Then Everett had said the sentence Laurel never forgot. "I cannot let my past keep deciding my future." She had stood outside the door with one hand around the ultrasound envelope. "You were talking about the company," Laurel said. "I know that now." Everett's expression changed. He remembered saying it. At the time, the sentence had meant headlines, speculation, and a board that treated his private life like another quarterly risk. "Laurel, I was not talking about you. But I was your past." Her voice remained calm. "Our marriage was your past. And I was standing there carrying 2 children you did not know existed, wondering whether bringing them into your life would make them another problem your lawyers had to solve." Everett leaned forward, then stopped himself from reaching for her. "You thought I would not want them?" Laurel looked at him for several seconds. "I thought you would want responsibility. That is not the same thing." The distinction left him silent. She knew him too well. Everett would have paid every bill. He would have hired the best physicians, arranged security, opened trust accounts, and built schedules. He would have done everything measurable. Laurel had needed to know whether he could do something that could not be delegated. "Stay. I walked out of your office," she continued. "I found a smaller apartment in Brooklyn. I kept working. I bought 2 cribs. I learned which grocery store delivered after 9 at night. I built a life that did not depend on whether you had room for us." Everett looked toward her overnight bag again. Suddenly every ordinary item seemed like evidence of months he had missed. "You should have told me," he said, but there was no accusation left in the words. Laurel gave him a tired look. "Maybe I should have. I have asked myself that every day." She paused. "But I was afraid you would turn fatherhood into another obligation on your calendar, and I could not raise children waiting for their father to finish a meeting." Everett lowered his gaze. There was nothing he could say that would erase the version of himself she had known. An apology could acknowledge the past, but it could not rewrite it. Before he could answer, the monitor changed rhythm and a nurse entered quickly, followed by another member of the medical team. Laurel's attention shifted immediately. Everett stood and moved aside. The physician spoke calmly, explaining that labor was progressing faster than expected, and they needed to prepare. Everett looked at Laurel. For the first time since he entered the room, something beneath her composure flickered. Not panic. Uncertainty. He stepped toward the door because he assumed they would ask him to leave. Laurel watched him go. Just before he crossed the threshold, her voice stopped him. "Everett." He turned. Her fingers rested against the blanket, and her eyes held his. "Do not leave the hospital." Everett nodded once. "I will be right outside." And for the first time in years, Laurel believed he might actually mean it. The door closed between them, leaving Everett alone beneath the soft hospital lights with nothing to do but keep his promise. He sat in a molded chair across from Laurel's room, his black tuxedo suddenly looking absurd against the pale walls and framed photographs of newborn hands. For years, waiting had been something he avoided. Cars waited for him. Employees waited outside conference rooms. Entire negotiations paused until he entered. Now he could not accelerate a single second. His phone remained turned off. Daniel appeared at the end of the hallway 20 minutes later carrying Everett's overcoat and a paper cup of coffee. "The hotel is chaos," he said quietly. Everett accepted the coffee but did not drink it. "Claire." "She left with her sister. Your mother wants to speak with you. Public relations says guests are already posting online." Everett looked toward Laurel's closed door. "Handle what you can." Daniel hesitated. "And the board?" "Tomorrow. They are asking whether this affects Monday's announcement." Everett finally looked at him. 2 children are being born today. Monday can wait. Daniel had heard Everett postpone meetings before, but never with such certainty. He nodded and walked away without another question. Everett leaned back and stared at the untouched coffee between his hands. Through the door came muted voices, footsteps, and the steady electronic sounds of equipment. He thought of Laurel carrying grocery bags up the stairs to her Brooklyn apartment. He imagined 2 cribs assembled without him, medical appointments attended without him, tiny clothes washed and folded while he sat through dinners discussing quarterly forecasts. Every image arrived too late. His money could replace furniture. It could not purchase the months he had missed. Another hour passed. A physician came out and explained that Laurel was doing well, but the twins were arriving earlier than expected, and the team wanted to remain cautious. Everett listened without interrupting. "Can I see her?" he asked. "Not yet." So he stayed. Evening settled over Manhattan, turning the windows at the end of the corridor dark enough to reflect his own face. His bow tie was gone now. His collar was open. The polished version of Everett Langford who had stood beneath wedding flowers that afternoon seemed like someone from another life. Then the hallway changed. Nurses moved with greater purpose. A cart rolled past. Everett stood as the physician returned through Laurel's door. No one told him anything for several minutes. He remained exactly where Laurel had asked him to remain. Then from somewhere beyond the closed doors, a thin cry broke through the quiet. Everett stopped breathing. It lasted only a few seconds before fading beneath the sounds of the hospital. He stared toward the doorway, uncertain whether he had imagined it. Then another cry followed, smaller but unmistakable. 2. Everett lowered himself slowly into the chair. His hands, steady through billion-dollar negotiations in rooms full of hostile investors, trembled against his knees. He covered his mouth with one hand and looked down at the floor. He did not know their names. He did not know what color blankets Laurel had chosen for their cribs. He did not know whether they would have her eyes or his, but they were here. A nurse emerged several minutes later with a smile that told him the answer before she spoke. "Your son and daughter are doing well. Their mother is resting." Everett closed his eyes briefly. Relief moved through him so deeply that he could not answer at first. "Thank you," he finally said. The nurse waited, then gestured down the hall. "They will be taken to the nursery for observation. You can see them through the window." Everett followed her until they reached a wide pane of glass. Beyond it were 2 bassinets positioned side by side. The babies were impossibly small, wrapped securely in soft hospital blankets, their faces peaceful beneath tiny caps. Everett stepped closer to the glass. Everything he had spent his life building suddenly felt very far away. The nurse stood beside him for a moment before asking softly, "Mr. Langford, when they are ready, would you like to meet your son and daughter?" Everett kept his eyes on the 2 bassinets. When he answered, his voice was quiet. "Only if their mother says I can." Laurel did not answer immediately when the nurse asked whether Everett could come in. She was exhausted, her hair loose around her face, the room dimmer now that evening had settled beyond the windows. Beside her, 2 bassinets stood close enough for her to reach without leaving the bed. She looked at them first, then toward the door. "He can come in," she said. Everett entered without his jacket, his white shirt slightly wrinkled after hours in the hallway. He stopped when he saw the babies beside her. Through the nursery glass they had seemed almost unreal, 2 tiny strangers connected to him by a fact he was still learning how to understand. Here, only a few feet away, they became something else. His son shifted beneath a cream blanket. His daughter slept with one small hand near her cheek. Everett remained near the door. Laurel noticed. "You can come closer." He crossed the room slowly. "What did you name them?" Laurel looked toward the bassinets, and something warm softened her tired expression. "Miles Everett Bennett and Nora Grace Bennett." Everett's eyes lifted at the middle name. Laurel did not explain it. She did not need to. Even during the months when she had believed she would raise them without him, some quiet part of his place in their story had survived. Everett looked down at Miles. "May I hold him?" Laurel watched him for several seconds before nodding. "Sit first." Everett obeyed immediately. Laurel showed him where to place his hands, how to support the baby's head, how not to rush. When she finally placed Miles into his arms, Everett became completely still. The baby weighed barely more than 5 pounds, yet Everett held him as though the entire room depended on his careful attention. His hands trembled. Laurel saw it. She remembered those same hands signing contracts without hesitation, fastening cuff links while answering calls, resting on steering wheels as he rushed toward another meeting. She had never seen them uncertain. Miles opened his eyes for only a moment, then settled against Everett's chest. Everett stared down at him. "Hello," he whispered. One ordinary word spoken like a confession. Laurel turned toward Nora and adjusted the edge of her blanket. Everett noticed a small notebook on the bedside table. Feeding times were already written inside. Beside it sat insurance forms, pediatric information, and a handwritten list of things Laurel still needed for the apartment. Nothing was extravagant. Everything was practical. "You planned all of this yourself," Everett said. "I had time." There was no bitterness in her voice. That made the answer harder to hear. "I can help with anything you need." Laurel looked at him. "Do not start with money." Everett went quiet. "I was not trying to insult you." "I know. That is why I am telling you now." She glanced at Miles in his arms. "They do not need a billionaire. They need a father." Everett lowered his eyes to his son. "I do not know how to do this." "Neither do I." "You look like you do." Laurel almost smiled. "That is because you missed the months when I was terrified." Everett absorbed that without defending himself. After a moment he asked, "What does being their father look like to you?" Laurel considered the question. "It looks like showing up when nobody is watching. Doctor appointments. 3 in the morning. Tuesday afternoons. Days when there is nothing important enough to photograph." Everett nodded slowly. "Then that is where I start." Laurel studied him, searching for the familiar confidence that usually turned promises into declarations. It was not there. He looked frightened, tired, and strangely human. Miles made a small sound, and Everett instinctively adjusted his arm the way Laurel had shown him. She watched him get it right. A nurse entered a few minutes later and explained that both babies would remain under observation overnight. Everett immediately began to stand, assuming Laurel needed rest. "I can wait outside," he said. Laurel looked at the chair beside her bed, then at the sleeping child in his arms. "You can stay until he wakes up." Everett sat back down. He did not thank her as though she had granted him something permanent. He simply stayed. And in the quiet hospital room, with Manhattan glittering beyond the window and his unfinished wedding disappearing into yesterday, Everett began learning the first rule of the life he had almost missed. Love was not proven by arriving dramatically once. It was proven by being there the next time and the time after that. By sunrise, Everett's unfinished wedding had become public news. His phone came back to life with more than 100 messages, but the first one he opened was from Daniel. Photographs of Everett leaving the hotel in his tuxedo were everywhere. Reporters had gathered outside Langford Meridian headquarters, and the board wanted an emergency meeting before the markets opened. Everett stood near the hospital window while Laurel slept and the twins rested beside her. He read the messages once, then slipped the phone into his pocket. When Laurel woke, she found him warming a bottle under a nurse's instructions. His sleeves rolled to his forearms and his expression more focused than she had ever seen during a business dinner. "You have somewhere to be," she said. Everett glanced at the clock. "I have several places people expect me to be." "That was not my question." He looked at Miles and Nora. "Then no." Laurel said nothing. She had heard promises before. By 8:30, Daniel arrived with a tablet and an expression Everett recognized immediately. "Your mother is downstairs. The board is waiting by video conference." Public relations drafted a statement. Everett stepped into the hallway with him. Daniel handed over the tablet. The statement described a private family matter, requested discretion, and carefully avoided confirming anything. Everett read it once. "No." Daniel lowered his voice. "There is another problem. Some directors want confirmation of paternity before the company acknowledges the children." Everett's face became still. "The company does not acknowledge my children." "Ido." "They are worried about liability." "Then tell them to worry quietly." Daniel studied him. "Reporters are asking whether Laurel interrupted the wedding." Everett looked through the narrow window in the hospital door. Laurel was adjusting Nora's blanket. She had not called him. She had not contacted the press. She had spent months building a life that required nothing from his name, and now strangers were preparing to turn her into the villain of a story she had never asked to enter. "Set up one camera downstairs," Everett said. "No press conference. No questions." 20 minutes later, he stood before a plain hospital wall instead of the polished backdrop his communications team preferred. He had changed nothing about himself. His shirt was still wrinkled. His tie was gone. Daniel gave a small signal when the camera began recording. Everett looked directly into the lens. "Yesterday, 2 children were born. I am their father. Their mother did not contact me, did not interrupt my wedding, and did not ask for public attention. Any suggestion otherwise is false. She deserves privacy and respect. My children deserve the same. Questions about my decisions should be directed at me, because those decisions are mine to answer for." He paused. There were 100 things a public relations advisor might have added. Everett added none of them. That is all. The recording lasted less than a minute. By the time he returned upstairs, his mother was waiting outside Laurel's room in a cream coat, her posture rigid. "Everett, you are exposing the company to unnecessary scrutiny." He stopped in front of her. "No. I exposed Laurel to scrutiny when I left people enough silence to invent a story about her." His mother lowered her voice. "You walked away from a wedding in front of 200 people. I know. And Claire." Everett's expression softened with regret. "I owe Claire an apology that cannot be made in public." His mother looked toward the hospital door. "You cannot repair one mistake by destroying everything else." Everett rested his hand on the door handle. "I am not repairing anything yet. I am showing up." When he entered, Laurel was sitting beside the bassinets with her phone in her hand. She had seen the recording. Everett did not ask what she thought. He simply crossed to the sink, washed his hands, and moved toward Miles when the baby began to stir. Laurel watched him lift their son carefully. "You did not have to say that publicly," she said. Everett adjusted the blanket around Miles. "Yes, I did." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because you spent 8 months protecting them from my life. The least I can do is stop my life from blaming you for something you never did." Laurel's eyes lowered to Nora. She did not smile. She did not forgive him. But when Everett sat beside her, she did not move away. Outside, his company faced reporters, his abandoned wedding filled headlines, and the future he had planned was disappearing by the hour. Inside, Nora wrapped her tiny fingers around Laurel's thumb while Miles slept against Everett's chest. For the first time, Everett understood that losing control of his old life might be the only way he could learn how to deserve a place in the new one. 3 months later, Everett knew exactly which floorboard in Laurel's Brooklyn apartment creaked outside the nursery. He knew Miles preferred to be held against the left shoulder after a bottle, and Nora became restless whenever the apartment grew too quiet. He knew the pediatrician's office opened at 8 in the morning, that Laurel bought coffee from the corner shop on Thursdays, and that 2 diaper bags were easier than one only if someone remembered to refill both. None of those things appeared on financial reports. None required a press release. That was precisely why they mattered. Everett had not bought Laurel a penthouse. He had offered once to find her a larger place, and she had answered with a calm look that ended the conversation. Instead, he paid his share of the children's expenses through an agreement they made together, kept a changing table at his apartment, and rearranged his calendar around the twins rather than expecting the twins to fit around Langford Meridian. On Tuesday afternoons, Daniel blocked Everett's schedule without explanation. The board eventually stopped asking why. One rainy morning, Laurel opened the nursery door and found Everett asleep in the chair beside the window. His expensive coat had been folded beneath his head as a pillow. An empty bottle rested on the table, and Miles slept safely in the bassinet beside him. Everett had arrived shortly after 2 that morning when Laurel called because both babies were awake, and she had not slept for more than an hour. He had answered on the first ring. No driver. No assistant. No announcement. He had simply come. Laurel stood in the doorway for several seconds before quietly walking away. When Everett woke, there was a fresh cup of coffee beside him. He carried it into the kitchen, where Laurel was standing near the window with Nora in her arms. "Thank you," he said. Laurel glanced at the cup. "You looked like you needed it." Everett smiled faintly. I meant for calling me. She looked at him then. 3 months earlier, she would have heard strategy hidden inside those words. Now there was only gratitude. You are their father, she said. I am learning. You are. The acknowledgement was small, but Everett received it without reaching for more. That had become another lesson. He could not negotiate forgiveness. He could only become someone Laurel no longer needed to protect herself from. Claire had ended their engagement formally the week after the hospital. Everett met her privately, apologized without excuses, and accepted her decision. She deserved a future that was not built around the consequences of his past. His mother eventually stopped suggesting solutions. The headlines disappeared. Another scandal replaced his. Markets moved on. Life became ordinary again, except Everett no longer confused ordinary with unimportant. One Sunday afternoon, sunlight filled Laurel's living room while Miles and Nora slept in their bassinets near the couch. Everett sat across from Laurel at the small dining table, drinking coffee from a chipped blue mug. His phone rested inside his coat pocket by the door. He had not checked it once. You are different here, Laurel said. Everett looked toward the twins. Maybe I am more myself here. Laurel considered that. I used to wait for you to become this man. Everett did not look away from her. I know. I stopped waiting. I know that too. Silence settled between them, but it no longer felt like the silence that had ended their marriage. This one had room inside it. Everett set down his mug. I am not going to ask you to take me back. Laurel's expression softened slightly. Good. He almost laughed. I deserved that. Probably. For the first time she smiled. Not the careful smile she gave nurses or neighbors. The old one. The one he remembered from takeout dinners and moving boxes, before success had taught him to hurry through everything worth keeping. Nora stirred softly. Everett stood automatically and crossed toward the bassinet. Laurel watched him lift their daughter and settle her against his shoulder. He did not look back to see whether Laurel was impressed. That was what made the moment matter. A few minutes later, Laurel carried her coffee to the couch and sat beside him, leaving only a small space between them. No promises were made. No ring appeared. Nothing needed to be decided that afternoon. Everett had once believed he left his wedding because he was choosing between two women. Months later, with his daughter sleeping against his chest and Laurel quietly beside him, he finally understood the truth. He had been choosing between the man he had been and the father he still had time to become. If this story reminded you that second chances are earned through actions, not promises, please give this video a like and share it with someone who believes people can truly change. Subscribe to Phoenix Soul Stories for more emotional stories of dignity, redemption, unexpected twists, and lives transformed when everything seems lost. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.